Arlene.
When I get a book, whether it's on Amazon, whether it's through the library, whether it's through um, a bookstore, I always look at the front cover and I go, how did you figure out to put that on the cover? What makes somebody do that? As a reader, I was always like that, and as an author, I'm the same way. So I will tell you how this title came about, because I just think it's so interesting that sometimes, and there's a story in everything I write about. There's always a story. So there is a story with this. And what happened is I worked the last 30 years for an online university. And when you work for an online university, they still have to go through faculty meetings, curriculum development, whatever, like in any organization. So because I worked for an online university, about 3 or 4 times a year, they brought everybody in from all over the country. A couple of people from other countries, but basically they brought us all in. And they brought us in for a week, and we worked from dawn to dusk. Then at dinner time, you were able to maybe go to dinner with somebody you had been working with online and you didn't know, or you love your field and you wanted to talk to people in your field. Or like me, actually, what I wanted to do was go back up to my room and just use the clicker and watch TV. I was exhausted. So about 6 months after my husband passed away, one of my friends, a gentleman, called me and he said, Arlene, even though we're there for a week, would you like to have dinner one night? And we can talk about university stuff, we can talk about academics, we can talk about we can just have a nice visit. And I said, okay, that'd be lovely. And let me just say, as a sidebar, he had a partner for many, many years, so I wasn't worried about that piece of it. In any case, we sit and we have dinner, and we started to do that each time we came in. As I said, about every 3 or 4 months. One night, we'd have dinner. Well, after a year and a half, he said to me, he would call me, say, which night would you like to have dinner, and etc. And this is a very spiritual, thoughtful, highly intellectual gentleman. And so he said, this time when we come in, it's been a year and a half since your husband passed. I want to discuss 2 things with you. And I said, okay. So we sit down to have dinner, and we have 4 courses. And in the first course, he says, an appetizer, he says, you know what, Arlene, this is what I want to discuss with you. I want to talk to you about the fact that it might be time for you to move on. And the other thing I want to talk to you about is that it might be time for you to sell your house. You have a big house, it's expensive, it's hard to keep up, you need resources. And I'm going to be polite. And I said, thank you. Now, as a sidebar, there is something you never say to a widow. And people mean well, they really do. But they say to you, it's time maybe to move on. I don't even know what that means, but that's what they say. And every widow with whom I've interviewed, had conversations with, says the same thing. We don't even understand that. For me, to be personally honest with you, moving on meant I was leaving my husband someplace. And that wasn't ever going to happen, and it hasn't since. And then selling my house, which I understand it's a big house. Widows are not silly. We don't need help figuring these things out. Never say these things. I didn't want to leave my memories, my experiences, my history, my parties, my children's homework, argument. You just don't want to leave your home until you're ready, unless it's an economics issue. If it's an economics issue, that comes first. But if it's not, you don't want to hear those things. So he says those 2 things to me over an appetizer. I say nothing. We get to salad, and he says to me, again, Arlene, I want to discuss this with you, moving on and possibly selling your house. Again, I say thank you for sharing, and I'm very polite, which if you know me real well, that doesn't happen often. So anyway, we get through the appetizer, the salad, and now they bring our food. Now, he eats meat and I eat meat. Not often, but we eat meat. So he cuts the steak and he takes half and gives me half. And there he goes again. Well, I'm like baseball, 3 strikes, you're out. So he says, same thing. And I just don't know what to do at this point. So I look down, and if you're ever in a good restaurant or a steakhouse, there's a steak knife they give you. The bottom half is wooden handle, and the top half is a blade with a serrated edge. Well, I'm looking at this knife, and I'm listening to this, and I don't know what to do with this. I pick up the knife, and I say, let me explain something to you. If you tell me to move on or sell my house one more time, I'm going to lunge across this table. Now, this is a spiritual, calm human being who thinks he's taking me to another space. And so it's like dead silence. Well, if you've ever been in a restaurant with somebody holding a knife and the other person is absolutely dumbfounded, you know how long a minute or two is. So it's very quiet, and he's just looking at me. I put the knife down, and he says to me, you know, Arlene, you may never be able to move on, but I bet you can move forward. And with that, this light bulb goes off in my head, and I said, oh, I can do that. I know how to move forward. I did that my entire life. So hence the title. And the reason it says The Widow's Journey is if you've been alive over the last 10 years, you know, moving forward could apply to so many things. So my editors wanted it to be so that people would know what it was about. So that's how this book got its titles and the story that goes with it. So I wanted to share that with you, but when that light bulb goes off in your head, it goes off. So what I would like to do is read you a short couple of paragraphs, really just 2, about what I consider to be this journey through widowhood is like. Actually, I compare it to a train ride. So when you envision a train, you can picture a long line of separate cars. And life moves forward from the last car to the first car. And you slowly move, eventually shutting the door to the previous compartment and moving to the next one. That moving forward, letting go of one door and stretching for the next one often shakes every part of you. And if you've ever really been on a train and you left one compartment and go to the next, you're on a platform. And that platform on the train is like, oh. But the reality is that's what moving forward in a widowhood is frequently like. And you do go from one compartment to the next, but it's a tough, shaking world. And when I lost the love of my life, I was keenly aware of every single movement, often as if it were in slow motion. I chose to open the door and reach for the next compartment, still seeing the compartment behind me, but moving forward to the next one on my own. I find comfort in knowing I can always look back to see and remember everything in the compartments, while I also know there is much to do in the one I'm in now. So I wanted to share that with you because for some of us, and some of us do it slowly and some of us move faster, but it is a lot of stress, and we need those friends that help us. That's really important through this. So the book itself, believe it or not, although I wrote every word and felt every emotion, this book, I believe, has a life of its own. I wrote it, but there were things that happened along the way that helped me write it. So one of the first things that happened was, as I said, after my husband died, 3 months later, I had to go into Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the base of the university, main office. And so the president of the university, the first time I had to go in 3 months later, called me up. His name is Dr. Roger Sublette, and he has a lovely wife named Cindy Sublette. And he called me up and he said, Arlene, Cindy and I, if you're up to it, would like to take you to brunch. And I said, oh, okay, you're coming in, you'll be in the hotel, and we'd like to take you to brunch. And I said, well, first of all, he's the president of the university. I'm not saying no. If the president calls you, you say, yes, sir. Aside from that, my husband and I had become rather friendly with this, couple. And so I knew this would be a safe space. So we go, we have brunch, and we spend the whole time talking about the things Howard did for me the last 9 months of his life, because he knew Howard was never going to survive. We knew this was a fait accompli. And so he spent 9 months really helping me. So I talked to Dr. Sublette and his wife, and I said, this is what he did, and this is what he did. And that's really part one of my book, all the things that he did to help me. And we left brunch, and we get in the car to take me back to the hotel. And Roger says, when you go home, you should jot these things down that he did for you. You don't have to write paragraphs. You don't have to write a lot, but just dot point. We used to call them bullet points. I learned something new every day. Now it's dot points. In any case, I went home. I wasn't going to do it, but I said, what could it hurt? So I just jotted down all the things that I had spoken with them about. I write everything on a yellow legal pad first. Thousands of papers of yellow legal pad in my life. And I took it, I write in pen, I put it on the top of my desk. I did not touch it, just like I didn't write this book, for 5 years. But it sat there. Of course, it ultimately became the basis for the book. Just putting it up there. The second thing that happened was 3 women who did not know each other. They were friends of mine, but they lived in different parts of the country. And they said to me, individually, having nothing to do with each other, they said, Arlene, you should write about your process. And I said, what process? I don't have a process. They said, yes, you have a process. And I'm having 3 conversations of people telling me I have a process, and I didn't know I had a process. Apparently, I had a process. And what the process was really based on practicality. Because the first year after he died, I had to fix things. Because when somebody's bedridden and you need a new roof because it's leaking, you can't let them go on the roof and be banging on this guy's head. So I put on a roof. Then, of course, for those of us who live in lovely South Florida, we know what termites are. Of course, I had termites, but when you have termites, at least at that time, you have to leave the house, they tent the house, put in poison so it kills the termites. And you have to leave for 2 days. I couldn't leave. So that first year, I did all these things that had to be done. The second year, they said, what did you do the second year? I said, everything with paper. I did a will, a trust, I put the house in my name, I had to put bank accounts in my name, the car in my name, all these things, anything that dealt with paper. And then what I realized I was doing, not knowing I was doing it, was I was giving myself a year, because I'm a pretty good goal-oriented person, but I gave myself a whole year because I said, you think you're going to do it in the winter, but maybe you don't get to it, and you do it in the summer, but they don't finish in the summer, so it goes into the fall. But if you give yourself a year, you really end up getting it all done. And it's just funny. And I've spoken, I think the first time I spoke at Books and Books, and some woman waited at the end, and she said, I'm divorced, I'm not a widow, but somebody told me about your book, and I was stuck as a divorcee, and this helps me. And I said, well, I can't speak to divorce. I never speak to something I cannot speak to. I said, widowhood, I'm an expert, but divorce, no. So, but it's amazing how these things happen. And so I wrote about my process in the book because apparently I had a process. In year 3, I went upstairs, did all the things that had to be tossed upstairs. So each year I had this process. The last thing that happened, which also impacted the writing of this book, was I get my hair dyed. And so when you get your hair dyed, you sit for 32 minutes with dye on your head. Your hairdresser either sits and chit-chats with you, or they go to the next client while you're sitting there. Well, my hairdresser does sit quite a bit. And he knew all about Howard, and he knew about the death, and he knew about my house and what I was doing. So at about the 4th year, I was talking to him while I had the dye on my head, and he said, you know, Arlene, those 3 women are right. You should write a book about that. And I said, why? And he said, because I happen to have other clients, and they are also 2 live in our community. One lives pretty close, one lives further out, but they're within the community, and you should talk to them. And I said, okay, but I can't go around calling women and saying, by the way, you have a husband who died, I have the husband who died, we should have a chat. They're going to think I'm insane. So he said, no, I'll call them or I'll email them and I'll get them, you know, to see if they want to speak with you. I said, then I'll speak with anybody. Sure enough, he did, they wanted to. And so I met with these 2 women separately. They never met each other in the book. And that lunch that I had with them each turned into 4 lunches. And we had these wonderful conversations, which hopefully none of you can have like I can have with them, because we wear the same shoes, we travel this journey. So that was great. So I have another friend who's African American, and she said, you know, Arlene, what was the ethnicity of these 2 women? And I said, I don't know what she says. I said, well, one was Christian, one was Jewish. And she said, well, I have a friend who's African American, and you should interview an African American. So I told her the same thing. I said, great. I said, but you have to connect, which she did. And I met with the woman, and I had 4 interviews with her. Then I went to Portugal with friends of mine, whom I felt safe with, a couple, and I felt safe with them. And we go, and we're in Portugal, and I had about 8 pages sketched out. And I said, I know, would you just take a look, see? Am I up a tree? You know, what do you think? And she said, she looked at it, she goes, no, she goes, my cousin, who's Portuguese, lives in France. And she had young children when her husband died. And she said, when you have young children, it's a whole different experience, because she had 2 children, it's the 3 of you going through this together because they're little. This went on and on. I have another friend who's from India, and she wanted me to interview her cousin who's from India. I went right to Verizon and bought an international chip. That was the first thing I did with that. I have another friend who's, she said, my friend Barbara has buried 2 husbands. You should speak with her. So this is the most diverse group you've ever come across, certainly the most diverse group. And so I embed them sort of, but then the 3rd part of the book just is sort of their stories, how they moved forward. And it's very interesting because part of it is their culture, part of it is just their history, and part of it is there are similarities. I don't go into that too much, but there are similarities. So it was a very interesting thing. So here I had the president telling me to jot down what Howard did. Then I had these 3 women telling me how to process. And now I'm interviewing people, 13 women, which is actually 52 interviews, 13 women who represent ages 32 to 82. They represent every possible culture. They represent husbands who were sick, who were not. Actually, 2 of them were planning weddings, and their husbands died unexpectedly, and they ended up planning a funeral as they were planning a wedding. So you just never know. So that's why I say this book really has a life of its own. These things came to me, it was meant to be, and so I did want to share that with you. There's something else that we go through, all of us in life, which are making choices. And as widows, now you're making choices not just based on you want to choose, but choices that your husband or spouse or partner would have taken up. So throughout this experience, choices, which then lead to decisions, are very important. But there were 3 choices I made immediately, within 3 weeks after my husband died. I don't know how, I don't know why I decided these things, but I did. One was to wear black for the whole year. One was not to listen to music, and one was not to dance. Dance. So wearing black is a traditional expression of mourning in many cultures, including our own, though American widows tend not to adhere to such rigorous customs. I decided this discipline suited me and immediately moved all the clothes that weren't black out of my closet. For 1 year, I would focus my energies on getting through each day and maintaining my emotional stability, not on what I would be wearing or did this look right. What I soon discovered was that this choice not only freed me from issues of fashion and appearance, it also set me on a path of simplicity. It became easier to move through the day, and at the end of the day, drop my simple black clothes into the laundry basket, take a hot shower, and crawl into bed. When the next day arrived, simplicity prevailed. Year 1 went by in this fashion or lack of it. No music. Whatever era we come of age in my case it was the 60s, we all remember beloved music and lyrics of the day. What's more, throughout the course of a long relationship, certain songs accrue special meaning. Music has a way of evoking memories, moments, and firsts as nothing else can, and producing what's known as a frisson. A frisson is a French word, and it means a shiver. It's akin to like an electric current. You could listen to a song and you, So I knew that getting through all of the milestones of year 1, birthdays, anniversaries, and such, would be difficult. I decided it might be easier to weather these occasions without the additional association and feelings called up by the music that had become meaningful to Howard and me. So there were some songs that were like very important to us. But you add to that the romantic strains of Johnny Mathis, Roberta Flack, and the rest of the romantic slow dance music of those years, even operatic arias, Broadway show tunes. Sometimes a Hallmark commercial jingle could set off a flood of feelings. So I made a conscious effort to avoid this stimulus during year 1, knowing that eventually these songs would provide comfort rather than sheer pain. No dancing. Remembering the shared feelings, the closeness, the touch can be overwhelming. I had often described life with Howard as a dance. So when that dance ended, it made sense for me to take a break from literal dancing. Again, this left me more able to focus on what I needed to accomplish that day. It also offered me an excuse for declining invitations to parties and gatherings, which spared me the experience of sitting at a table while the music and other couples spun around me. Not attending parties was a beneficial result of my moratorium on music and dancing. My choices fit together, and they fit me. So those are all sort of beginning experiences. But there's also something that happens called firsts. There are certain things you did that seemed quite normal. Now you go, uh-oh, now I may have to do this again. So one of the firsts, which I'm not going to go into, had to do with having guests for dinner. I had had a wonderful experience of gatherings and parties in my house and dinners and having other couples for dinner, and I said, okay, Arlene, you've got to, and I'll let you read about that if you read the book. But that was very difficult, but I had 2 couples I was very good friends with. I felt safe, and I invited them separately for what I called a practice dinner. Now, I want to be clear, I failed both times. 6 months later, I had them over again, and I didn't fail. But boy, did I screw up the first ones. The other first is really very interesting. because it's something that doesn't involve other people. It involves you. And that is your first laugh. 3 years after Howard died, my friend Bud was planning a trip to Barcelona with a couple and invited me to join them at the last minute. I said I'd think about it, hung up the phone, looked in the mirror and said, I don't think so. They were leaving in 2 weeks. How could I possibly consider it? When I mentioned the invitation to my daughter that evening, she didn't hesitate. Just go, she said. Get on that plane and go. You can afford a ticket, Bud will take care of you, and you might even have a good time. And what's the worst? You can always get on a plane and come home. I said, oh. I had never even met the other couple, but I trusted Bud. And as you'll get through my book, if you do, you'll see that to me, trust has everything to do with moving forward. After a bit of thought, I embraced the idea and said yes. I didn't know what I was doing, but I said yes. As it worked out, I had to travel to Spain and back alone. I found my way to the hotel without incident and was welcomed by warm and wonderful people. What I'd never expected, and I mean never, was that I'd experience a major first on Sunday, December 18, 2016, having survived walking with my old friend and my new ones through a torrential rainstorm. Now, we are familiar with torrential rainstorms. This was, other than being a hurricane, as torrential as it gets. It was so bad that my shoes, I was wearing flats, my shoes fell apart. The bottoms were on one side of the street. The others were on my feet. They just fell apart. But we went through this torrential rainstorm to a restaurant called Seven Portas, and we looked at our bedraggled, soggy selves and started laughing. My companions laughed, and I laughed right along with them. This is one of those exuberant, overpowering belly laughs, the kind I had not experienced in years. We dried off as best we could, sat and ordered food, and we kept laughing. And I continued to laugh with them until happy tears started coming down my cheeks. As a matter of fact, my head actually almost hit the table a couple of times. I had not really laughed in 3 years, but that night the spell was broken. So sometimes a first is a first. As I said, you make choices, and out of the choices, you make decisions. And whether I'm speaking as Arlene or I'm speaking as someone who's an author, you really have to look at the fact that you have decisions that actually become concepts. So I had two that I will share with you. One was being almost happy. 5 years after Howard's death, I began to feel happiness again, within limits. I guess you could say I was almost happy. The return of joy surprised me, but I knew it was real. At times, I'd catch myself singing or whistling around the house, but then something would remind me of Howard, and I'd fall back into sad reverie. I came to understand that being almost happy was a balancing act that would probably continue for a very long time. I decided that being almost happy might be good enough. It wasn't really so bad to dwell in a peaceful state while I was fully able to enjoy the moment, the day, or an experience. So what if challenges loomed on the horizon? That is part of moving through the world, something I'm proud to be able to do. And the other concept I talked about was that some people just no longer fit. This may be hard to fathom when you have just experienced a loss, but you may not need all the friends you can get. What I'm trying to say is that your life has changed profoundly, and there may be some perfectly lovely people and some not so lovely people in it who no longer fit. It's not their fault. It's not your fault. As your needs change, you change. There will be some loss. The first people to let go of are those who are negative by their very nature. When you had a partner, perhaps this negativity didn't affect you so much. Perhaps you didn't even notice it. We tend to be more tolerant of our friends' quirks when we have a partner to lean on. But after the loss, as profound as a spouse's death, we are already fighting against the clouds that surround us. The last thing we need is to bring some more bad weather into our lives. And I have to say, a year after I finished interviews and the women, read the book, who I interviewed, a year to 2 years after, almost everyone called me and said, I get almost happy. That saves me. I go, oh, goody, goody, because I didn't know. But I will say, with getting rid of negative people, one of the women, her name is Nettie, and it's very short, but she said, she also felt you have to eliminate negativity. And she said, and she used the phrase, like I tell people, I wish I had said it, but it's not mine, it's hers. I have no time for drama, she said. I think of negative people as energy vampires. I think that is the greatest phrase, the energy vampires who can suck you dry. And don't get me started on trying to fix them. That just isn't possible. Sometimes you just have to bite the bullet, get yourself some new friends who provide what you need, which is a measure of peace. And I would like to end this evening with exactly how I end the book. And I say, and I feel, it has taken me a long time to gain the perspective necessary to write moving forward. But that has been part of my journey too. I am so much stronger and more capable now than I was a few years ago. The view ahead has grown so much clearer, while looking back has become easier and less fraught with grief. I've gained valuable skills, made new connections, and begun defining my life as it is rather than as it was. Perhaps it is presumptuous, but I believe you, meaning the widows who are reading the book, or someone you feel would profit and benefit from this, either sooner or, as in my case, a bit later, will benefit from this. And widowhood is many things, but it is not a process that ends. It's life, and life is an open-ended journey. And I thank you so much for coming tonight and being with you, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you. So if you have any questions or comments, I'm pleased to hear them, and if not, again, I thank you.
I have questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I've written my questions down.
Uh-oh.
I've been preparing them.
Oh, goodness.
Were there any particular moments or events that were especially challenging to write about?
I had a section, it's a great question, and I don't get asked that question. Now, many of you, I was 66 when Howard died. At 66, I hear people die, they're 30, they're 50, they're 90, people die. But none of my immediate friends, no matter where they lived, had lost a spouse. I was the first. So I didn't have any role models. And that was hard. But what was worse was my mother had passed and my father did not behave. And so where I would have had a role model, I didn't. So that was tough to write about, I must say. A good question.
Okay. Did you encounter any moments of doubt or fear when writing this book?
Not one.
Wow.
What's interesting as a secondary sentence, people said to me, was this book cathartic for you? And I said, no, not in the least. I had a purpose. I wanted to help other widows move forward, and it was not cathartic, although they thought so. I just am done with the second book, and that book deals with marriage, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that book was a killer. That was as cathartic as could be. This one, not so much. So I had no problem because I had such a mission. I wanted so much to help other widows and say, this is what I did in step one, this is what I did in step two, was so hard that I had no problems with that.
What do you do for the introverted widow? Because you're very extroverted.
Well, really? Out of the 13 women, there were many introverted, but we had a different type of conversation, and I try to be myself. And so they Some of them want to be like me, which is impossible. You can never be like somebody else. It's not possible. But what they understood from reading the book was, remember when you were little, you knew about an inchworm? Remember, like inchworm, for those of you who had, well, some people, especially introverts, they move like an inchworm. Some people move forward like step by step. Some people I just look at and I go, how did she do this so fast? So really, when I'm dealing with somebody introverted, I try to tell them a story. And then I try to be funny. Like, I can actually tell you funny cemetery stories. Now, that's not normal. But they go, oh, yeah, I know. And so if you can do that with a little bit of humor, there's just stories that I can tell people that they go, oh, and that helps.
Have you met widowers?
That's interesting. I had that somebody, I can't remember who it was. Actually, it was somebody from the South Florida Writers Association. They taped me for their Facebook page. And so she said, you have to say something about widowers because they want everybody to know about the book. And I said, I can't speak for a widower, but I did have a gentleman, actually 2 gentlemen who called me and said, this book's very helpful. Then I had, and this is really interesting, my dentist call me. And I was in Atlanta and I see his name. His name is Juan Salvat. And I see Juan Salvat on my phone. I said, did I miss an appointment? What do I have? I'm sitting in Atlanta. Why? And Juan Salvat called me up, my dentist, and he said, hello, Arlene, this is Juan. I said, hi, how are you? He said, I want to tell you, I got your book. I said, how'd you get my book? He said, my assistant gave it to me. I said, okay. He said, I just made an appointment on Miami Beach for a Holiday Inn for myself and my wife to go because I want her to know the things that Howard helped you that he was able to tell you. But if I, Dr. Salvat, want to help her, I want her to hear these things now. And so they went to Miami Beach to a Holiday Inn, and he spent the weekend trying to explain to her all the things that he did. So if something happened, so there are men who get something, but this book was really meant. I don't know how to speak as a widower. I only know how to speak as a lady.
Okay. Did you read any other books or authors on this topic?
No. Not a one. I'm very bad that way. I feel I know what I'm talking about. I have a mission and I'm doing it. And I was wrong, I'm sure. You know, because people said, didn't you go over to Barnes and Nobles and look at the shelves and see what people, I said, no. Now, there are many quotes in here. I mean, one of the best ones is, for those of you who know who Sheryl Sandberg is, Sheryl Sandberg's husband died when they were on vacation. She was, you know, the CEO of Facebook. She replaced Mark Zuckerberg. And her husband, they were on a vacation at a hotel, and he went to the gym, and she went to the pool with her friends, and it's an hour, it's 2 hours, and she says, you know, my husband's at the gym, he's there an awful long time, he knows to come to the pool. She said, I'm gonna go check. Of course, the end of the story is she goes and checks, and he's laying on the floor, you know, by the elliptical machine. So it was a terrible, terrible, difficult death. And what she wrote about, because somebody gave me the book Option B to read as a friend, as a favor, after Howard died, and I didn't purposely do this, but a great story she tells is her daughter had to go to a father-daughter dance, and she got no father, and it's very soon. So she asked a friend of theirs to please take the daughter to the father-daughter dance. And so she's sitting with the man, the friend who's going to take the daughter, and she says, I just wish, I think her husband's name was Mark, I'm not going to swear to it, but I just wish Mark was taking her and not you. And he said, well, that's option A, and we don't have that. We have option B. So let's just kick the shit out of option B. And I thought that I have, number of quotes, I'll quote Eleanor Roosevelt, but Sheryl Sandberg stays in my mind. So I really didn't read any books, but that statement was one that meant a lot to me.
What has been the most rewarding feedback you received from readers?
Different type. It's also a very interesting question. Different types of feedback, because I was the associate vice president. I worked under Dr. Nelson Soto, who's the vice president, and he read my book the minute he could get his hands on it. He read my book. He said, "I'm sitting the whole weekend. I'm reading your book." I said, "Okay, great." And he called me up, maybe 4 hours later, and he goes, "I'm sitting here crying from your book." I said, I'm not a punishment paradigm person. I didn't ask you to do it. Calls me back in the evening. He goes, "Now I'm laughing at all the stories in your book." So it's amazing. It's the emotional impact you have. And the best thing was that even people I've given the book to, they buy it for somebody else because they know that this could help somebody. So to me, that's everything. So what anybody gets out of it is up to them. But the fact that somebody's being helped is the greatest gift.
Any other questions? I take them all.
Well, thank you. Did you?
About what part was most difficult to write about. And I would think that personal.
My husband was so extraordinary to me, in my opinion. And I write about, in the next book also, I write about heroes. And he wasn't a hero. But a hero isn't what you think. A hero is an action. We think of heroes like in fairy tales, and we go, "Oh, the guys all have to look this way, and look what they make women." No, they have much, much, much greater significance. And so to me, what my husband did, and so I wasn't sad. I was a mess, but I wasn't sad while I was writing the book. Don't forget, I didn't write it for 5 years. But the fact that I could write about all the things he did for me while knowing you will not be here, I wasn't sad about that. I was proud of him. And the second part of the book deals with all the people who helped me. Extraordinary, wonderful people who came out of the woodwork to help me. Like I say, minus one thing, I am without doubt the luckiest girl in the world. And the third part, of course, is all the other women, and that was tremendous.
Really made meaning out of it.
If you're fortunate enough to have a mission and a passion, and I wrote even as a child. Remember Dear Diary? All that. When you write, you write. So I wrote even as a child. I wrote in a newspaper. I, was a professor. I was whatever. And this is just, I'm given this golden opportunity. And my editor actually says, Arlene, you write a teachable memoir. And I said, I didn't know there was such a thing. I know there's a memoir, and I know that. She goes, no, you write your memoir, but you're trying to teach somebody in it all the time. Same thing with the next one. So thank you. I know it's
Have you written other books?
Well, I have 3 books that were academic books. So they're like written for publishers, for library use, those. No, they were nothing like this. This took 3 years. The next book took 2.5 years. So no, only these 2 are like this. And these are what I call nonfiction. I don't really think I have the skills to write fiction, where you just comes out great mysteries or romances. I don't have that. I can write nonfiction. But it's lots of stories. Thank you. Have a good night.